Right, now, it's important, I think, to realise that Shakespeare was famous in his own time, but not as a dramatist. He was certainly known to be a dramatist, but you have to understand what kind of thing a dramatist was. It's a bit like being a writer for Coronation Street or EastEnders, that most plays were written by groups of people, by collaborators, who somebody would have the love interest, someone else would have the comedy bit, and so forth. And one of the odd things about Shakespeare is that he very seldom collaborated. And ironically, rather than finding out how it was that he managed to write his plays alone when other people mostly didn't, my colleagues keep trying to prove that he did collaborate on obscure plays that nobody reads and nobody cares about, which will give you an idea of what's kind of wrong with Shakespeare in academia. But Shakespeare was famous for something else. He was famous for the first, and some might say the only, work of housewife porn. And that was his Epilion, Venus and Adonis, about the seduction, the failed seduction of a beautiful boy by an older, powerful goddess woman, and the jealousy of Mars and the boar that buried its tusk in his groin. Where else? They were called luscious marrowbone pies for a housewife. This Epilion was called a luscious marrowbone pie because it was semi-pornographic, soft porn if you like, but it was written in the vernacular, which it already broke down one of the protective mechanisms. Gentlemen always had their pornography, but they were gentlemen who'd had a humanist education and who could read it in Latin. But Shakespeare wrote it in English. Now, most people don't realise that that was a huge bestseller. We know it went through 13 editions in a very short time, and it probably went through more, because in fact, the poem was read to pieces. And many of the editions that have survived are missing their title pages, so we don't really know what editions they are and where they belong. It is an extraordinary achievement. Shakespeare could have decided to make a career as a hanger-on in a nobleman's household, except for one small thing, that he wasn't a university man, he hadn't got a university degree, and he wouldn't be accepted as a tutor. And I think we can only be grateful that that didn't happen. It happened to Daniel, a good poet, who wrote almost nothing in the whole time that he was teaching the sons of the nobility. Now, Shakespeare couldn't have exploited that popularity because he didn't own the copyright of the poem. The copyright belonged to the printer. And so we can't be surprised, I suppose, that he returned to the theatre. But I think that it's more profound than that, that there was no future for him. He couldn't do the thing that he wanted to do if he continued to be shut up somewhere writing sixains. We don't know where he wrote it. I suspect he wrote it in Stratford. I mean, that's another obvious thing about Shakespeare. Born, christened in Stratford, buried in Stratford. Why do they want to tell you he's the Earl of Oxford? Just stop it. Stop being silly. Now, he goes back to the theatre in 1594, and by 1598, we have Francis Mears telling us in Palladius Tamia that he was known for his Gentleman of Verona, his Errors, the Comedy of Errors, his Love Labours Lost, Mears gets the titles a little bit wrong, his Love Labours Won, his Midsummer's Night Dream, which is a mistake our schoolchildren make all the time, and his Merchant of Venice. For tragedy, his Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and his Romeo and Juliet. It's a pretty extraordinary tally for a career that had barely begun when the theatres were closed in 92. Now, when I was an undergraduate, the authority in matters Shakespearean was E.M.W. Tillyard, who placed Shakespeare securely within his Elizabethan world picture, which was pretty much medieval, making him a chief apologist of the monarchy, the succession, and the Anglican Church. Little attention was paid in those days to the fact that the theatre is not a monarchy, but the place where the audience rules. That was before the Globe was built in London, before the audiences of today had the opportunity of seeing how their presence in daylight on three sides of the action helped to mould the play. Once you have witnessed what happens when the Globe audience draws in its collective breath, you understand how the audience is a dynamic presence in Shakespeare's Little O. I had no idea when I went to see Northern Broadside's play Midsummer Night's Dream at the Globe. I had no idea that when Hermia and Helena were being tormented by Puck's mistake, that the audience would go, and it would be like a little wind. It would be extraordinary, be like a note on an organ. You couldn't ignore it, but you need those things. You need daylight, you need the audience seeing each other, and you need the players like the yolk in an egg. So rather than accepting a sinecure in the household of a noble patron, after the closure of the theatres ended, Shakespeare returned to the stage. In Sonnet 111, he addresses an unknown someone who has upbraided him for this choice. Oh, for my sake, do you with fortune chide, the guilty goddess of my harmful deeds, that did not better for my life provide than public means which public manners breeds. Thence comes it that my name receives a brand, and almost thence my nature is subdued to what it works in, like the dyer's hand. For better or worse, then, Shakespeare is a playwright, whose works will appear and disappear according to the fortunes and the policy of the playhouses and the company. And in Shakespeare's Wife, I broach the possibility that the king's men were sick of Shakespeare, they didn't look after his play texts, and they were actually collected by someone else, someone who knew, in human terms, what it had cost to make them. And that person, I suspect, is Anne Shakespeare. Shakespeare will have no public profile as a playwright for the theatre. There will be no images of him, and practically all the images you see are wrong. I think there's one that has a better claim than the others, but it's not much of a claim. There will be no biography. Now, this is true of the playwrights who were hugely successful in the Elizabethan theatre. Not all Shakespeare's plays would be printed, and he would play no role whatsoever in their publication. His authorship will not always be recorded, and sometimes it will be claimed for plays he can't be shown to have written at all. The play scripts will remain the property of the company. The first playwright to supervise publication of his work would be Ben Jonson, whose works of poetry and prose appeared in the year of Shakespeare's death. Jonson's ego bulks large in the theatre. He was very keen on projecting his own image. Shakespeare's does not. As a player, Shakespeare belonged to a class of individuals not far removed from ballad sellers and tumblers. To be permitted to stage entertainments, the company had to rely on protection from a powerful individual. This did not prevent the gentlemen, schoolmen playwrights who had a classical education from talking down to their audiences, sneering at them, mocking them. It is further support for the identification of Shakespeare with the glover's son from Stratford that Shakespeare never condescended to his audience. Just think of the epilogue to Midsummer Night's Dream. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme no more yielding but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And that remains a theme in Shakespeare's epilogues and prologues, of which, by the way, there are very few. Now, this might be because they were written by other people and didn't turn up in the folio, or it might be for some other reason. Maybe he preferred not to write them. And so we have to, with Shakespeare, you always have to think of the other alternatives. Then if you think of Rosalind's, of the epilogue rather, oh, how did that happen? Oh, first my fear, the epilogue to Henry IV, Henry IV Part 2. First my fear, then my curtsy, last my speech. My fear is your displeasure, my curtsy my duty, and my speech to beg your pardons. If you look for a good speech now, you undo me. For what I have to say is of mine own making, and what indeed I should say will, I doubt, prove mine own marring, but to the purpose and so to the venture. Be it known to you, as it is very well, I was lately here in the end of a displeasing play, to pray your patience for it, and to promise you a better. I meant indeed to pay you with this, which if, like any ill venture, it come unluckily home, I break, and you, my gentle creditors, lose. Here I promised you I would be, and here I commit my body to your mercies. There was once a play at the Aldwych called Why Are We in Vietnam? And it ended a bit like that. It ended with the actors on the stage having finished their play but refusing to leave the stage, and the audience having to figure out, do we go now? Can we, what do they want us to do? And in the end, we did have to do that thing. It is time to leave, and we turned our backs on the actors and left. But even in that conventional cinema-type theatre, that was a very hard thing to do. And so we have the chorus of speaking the prologue in Henry V. And here, I love these prologues because they are so, again, so grateful for the offering of the audience. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, or times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply, admit me chorus to this history, who prologue-like your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. Now, the importance of the audience, I can give you another half dozen examples there, but we don't really have time for them all. But the thing that is so important here is that the actors are telling you, in one way or another, that they are only able to be in the theatre by your permission, that you have agreed for them to do this thing. It's not something you have to do because you're going to do it for A-level or for your exams. It is actually, you are looking to what? To learn something? To be delighted? For me, the most extraordinary one of these addresses is, of course, the one from Prospero at the end of The Tempest. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. Now, it's easy to imagine that that's Shakespeare's farewell to the stage. We can't be sure of that. But it is nevertheless astonishing that someone who had achieved so much would actually speak in an epilogue with such extraordinary humility. So far from talking down to his audience, Shakespeare invariably spoke up to them, regardless of whether he found himself in amphitheatre, like in the courtyard of an inn, or in the playhouse. The job of literary historians would be much easier if we could discern from the writing which audiences are catered for in which plays. Shakespeare's characters express fear of the multitude, much as actors express fear of the audience. The Archbishop of York says, "An habitation giddy and unsure hath he that buildeth on the vulgar heart." Shakespeare built on the vulgar heart. In metadramatic terms, the blunt monster with uncounted heads, the still discordant, wavering multitude, as they are described in the induction to the second part of Henry IV, that audience feared by the characters and the audience feared by the actors are one and the same. The motto of the Globe Theatre was Totus Mundus agit histrionem. The audience for every human act is God, or metonymically, heaven. The converse, that the audience is godlike, vox populi, vox Dei, is equally true. And it survives oddly in the fact that nowadays, when the cheapest seats are highest up in the theatre, that part of the auditorium is usually called the gods, and most of the audience sits above the stage. The higher the circle, the more seats are crammed into it, and the larger the proportion of the applause that comes from those skyey regions. Even in Shakespeare's theatre, when the greatest number of the audience stood below the stage, they were still cast in the role of heaven, as in the famous poem attributed to Sir Walter Raleigh, "What is our life? What is our life? A play of passion, our mirth, the music of division." And in that poem, it is said, "Heaven, the judicious sharp spectator is, that sits and marks still who doth act amiss." Now the grammar works both ways. Heaven is the spectator is heaven. There was no gentleman playwright who didn't question the right of his audience to sit in judgment on his work. George Whetstone complained that in the theatre, ignorant people laughed their betters to scorn. Stephen Gosson condemned the theatre because it didn't teach anything. John Lilly writhed under the precise judgments of the gentleman in his more select coterie audience. Francis Beaumont, in a commendatory poem to the very, very famous play of his colleague John Fletcher, denies the right of the audience in the theatre to judge the performance. Why should the man whose wit ne'er had a stain upon the public stage present his vein and make 1,000 men in judgment sit to call in question his undoubted wit? Scarce 2 of them can understand the laws they judge by. And he congratulates his colleague on getting his book printed, because at least that means the people who presume to judge it have got to know how to read. Johnson sneered at the wise and many-headed bench that sits upon the life of death of plays and wits, and especially at the shop's foreman or some brave spark that may judge for his sixpence. Shakespeare never did that. Though Thomas Middleton might revile a dull audience of stinkards sitting in the penny galleries of a theatre and yawning upon the players, and Michael Drayton his thick-brained audience, Shakespeare did not. Though Hamlet may despair of the groundlings with their taste for inexplicable dumb shows and noise, Shakespeare himself never instructed his audience how to behave. In the relatively few prologues and epilogues in the canon, the audience is never addressed with anything but courtesy, unless we accept Gower. There's a problem there because we know that not all of the play of Pericles is written by Shakespeare, at least we suspect. But this is what Gower says, which is extraordinary. "If you, born in these latter times, when wit's more ripe, accept my rhymes, and that to hear an old man sing may your wishes pleasure bring, I life would wish, and that I might waste it for you, like taper light. Burn myself down like a candle to please you. The problem remains with Gower's speech there. If Shakespeare didn't write it, who did? Because no one else ever addressed an audience with such reverence. Now, the action in the Elizabethan theatre takes place in coram populo, in the heart of the people, surrounded by people in daylight. A soliloquy is not an inner monologue, but a confession to the audience, a privileged communication shared with the audience and not with the other characters in the play. If you begin to see the dynamic in these terms, the plays work very differently. I had a disagreement with Mark Rylance, who has become now enormously famous and probably won't be working in the theatre anymore, in which I suggested that instead of pretending that he was talking to himself when he was doing a soliloquy, he should actually understand that there are a few hundred people listening, and he should recognise the obvious fact. You'll remember perhaps what happens when the Duke of Buckingham goes before the people in the Guildhall in Richard III. He expects them to acclaim the news that they have a new king, but they don't comply. They sit mum, they say nothing, they spake not a word, but like dumb statues or breathing stones, stared on each other and looked deadly pale. Which, when I saw, I reprehended them and asked the mayor, what means this wilful silence? It meant that the people withheld their consent, but their audiences, and that's all they can do. Bolingbroke, you'll remember, who will become Henry IV, invites the great unwashed to become his audience, diving into their hearts with humble and familiar courtesy. What reverence did he throw away on slaves, wooing poor craftsmen with the craft of smiles? Off goes his bonnet to an oyster wench. A brace of draymen bid God speed him well. Now, one of the great beliefs of the English Renaissance was that the people had a version of a compact with the monarch. The monarch was monarch by God's will, and the people accepted that relationship even when the monarch behaved badly. And when the monarch behaved badly, it was because of these other people, the nobles, who were misdirecting the monarch. Francis Mears, but to think of what's possible here, Francis Mears told us that in 1598 Shakespeare was known to be the author of Richard II. 3 years later, 3 years after Francis Mears, the Earl of Essex would pay the Lord Chamberlain's men, which was Shakespeare's company, 40 shillings more than their usual fee to perform the play with the deposition scene, which was usually left out, left in. Act 4, Scene 1 of Richard II is set in Parliament. That is to say, in the House of Lords, Westminster Hall, which still stands in London, where Bolingbroke, who had already assumed the role of monarch, adjudicates in a quarrel between two lords. York enters, acclaims Bolingbroke as king, and invites him to ascend the throne. The Bishop of Carlisle protests and is arrested for his pains. Bolingbroke demands that Richard be brought into his presence, that in common view he may surrender. Now, Richard has been a fractious, irresponsible boy king who believes that not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm from off an anointed king. Now, he's wrong. He's wrong. But the suggestion that he's wrong should indicate that, in fact, there is nothing God-given about kingship. It is a convention, and it is, and it's likely to be illegal, as likely to be a usurpation. The way Shakespeare manages this is extraordinary. Richard enters and asks for the crown. It is given to him, and he hands it to Bolingbroke. And then, when Bolingbroke grasps it, he continues to hold it, giving rise to an image that will govern the play to the end. The image of a deep well that owes two buckets, filling one another, the emptier always dancing in the air, the other down, unseen and full of water. Richard, deposed, helpless, is strangely growing in stature. It is he who divests himself of his attributes. Bolingbroke can say nothing, and this silly, unwise king makes an extraordinary statement, and you realize that the weight of the play has shifted completely. But what is happening is that Richard is turning to something other and greater than a king. He is turning into a man. Now that is a fundamentally subversive idea. It's never stated in the play, you simply see it. Now mark me, says Richard, how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight from off my head, and this unwieldy sceptre from my hand, the pride of kingly sway from out my heart. With mine own tears I wash away my balm. With mine own hands I give away my crown. With mine own tongue deny my sacred state. With mine own breath release all duty's rights. All pomp and majesty I do forswear. My manners, rents, revenues I forego. My acts, decrees, and statutes I deny. God pardon all oaths that are broke to me. God keep all vows unbroke that swear to thee. Make me that nothing have, with nothing grieved, and thou withal pleased that hast all achieved. Bolingbroke has been completely upstaged here. He is not even the architect of the deposition of the king. It can hardly be called a deposition. We might call it nowadays an abdication. The subversive potential of this scene was so great that it was illegal to stage it. The Queen was old and frail. The succession was in doubt, and there was rebellion among the lords. William Lambarde, the antiquary, has left us an account of the Queen crying out in exasperation, "I am Richard II, know you not that?" Lambarde didn't say, "Actually, ma'am, you're not descended from Richard II because he was displaced by Bolingbroke, and you're the child of a usurper." He was not so stupid as to say that. And she lamented that this tragedy was played 40 times in open streets and houses. This seems extraordinary, but isn't it amazing that people haven't taken on board what this means about Shakespeare and the crown? Yes, he would become a royal servant, but we can't find evidence that he ever played at court. He certainly never wrote a masque, for which he has to be congratulated, I'd have thought. Essex and Southampton actually believed that staging the play in toto would ignite popular revolt. But they were wrong. The rebellion failed, Essex lost his head, and his co-conspirator, Shakespeare's supposed patron, the Earl of Southampton, would remain in the Tower until the old Queen was dead. What makes Shakespeare's play subversive is not just the deposition scene, which is the fulcrum of the action, but the whole movement of the play, in which a weak and vacillating monarch who believes his power to come from God discovers that a king consists of actions that a man might play, while a man has that within which passeth show. That quotation, of course, comes from Hamlet. None of the attributes that Richard laid aside could make him great. What makes him a hero as the play moves towards its end is his stoicism and courage in the face of the common human lot. He must die, and he's pretty well aware that he will die at the hands of his jailers. The fact that the writing of chronicle plays, which gave people a reworked version of British history, the writing of these plays ends with the death of Elizabeth. And it may be that Elizabeth knew that she had the glamour and the charisma to play the king convincingly, and delighted in applause, which her bookish and unpopular successor feared. He feared to empower the mob, to shout him down. It seems, though, more likely to me that the chronicle plays end because of the growing tendency of Parliament and the city to frustrate the king's intentions and limit the power of the crown. Shakespeare's most subversive use of the king motif is in the tragedy of King Lear, in which it represents the autonomy of the individual, his little state of man, which is undermined and ultimately destroyed by aging itself. More daring, even than Richard II, is another of the plays noticed by Mears, which is King John. Now, I've been fascinated by this play forever because it is so crazily experimental. It does things that the theatre has not done since. It was never printed until the first folio, until 1623. And I fancy that too might have something to do with the subversive power of the play. 1623 is 7 years after Shakespeare's death. But as we see from Mears's list, it had been performed before 1598. The entire cast, with the exception of a character who is called alternately Citizen and or Hubert, is patrician. It begins with what Queen Eleanor calls a strange expression. Chatillon addresses King John. Thus, after meeting, speaks the King of France, in my behaviour to the majesty, the borrowed majesty of England here. The fact that King John is so experimental is part of my reason for supposing it to be early, probably earlier than Richard II. Shakespeare plays games with the role of the audience as spectator and adjudicator of the action. In the very first scene, the king's mother admits that right is not on his side, an admission, she says, that none but heaven and you and I shall hear, and heaven is sitting all around them. In all, there are 53 references to heaven in the play, the most remarkable being where Lady Falconbridge beseeches heaven not to blame her for the fact that her son Philip, otherwise known as the Bastard, was sired by Richard the Lionheart. In Act 2, Scene 1, is played before the walls of Angers. The French king announces that his cannon shall be bent against the walls of this resisting town, which places the audience in the role of helpless civilian victims. When Arthur of Brittany weeps to think that innocent people will die for his right, his tears are called heaven-moving. Heaven is invoked in that particular incident 5 times in 6 lines. The citizens of Angers are called to name their choice of king as either John or Arthur, and Hubert appears upon the walls to give the people's answer. The King John warns him, the cannons have their bowels full of wrath, and ready mounted are they to spit forth their iron indignation against your walls, all preparation for a bloody siege, all merciless proceeding by these French, confronts your city's eyes, your winking gates. And so it goes on. All the aggression is directed against this town, and they even speak about the walls of the theatre. These scroyles of Angiers flout you, kings, and stand securely on their battlements, as in a theatre, where they gape and point at your industrious scenes and acts of death. In other words, the historical action has become a masquerade. It's unreal. It's almost as if all the actors are wearing playing cards for their costume. They're called royal fronts. I'm running out of time a bit here, so I'm going to skip. But do read the play. When the bastard first drew his picture of war, war is a constant reality outside the walls of the town and against the walls of the town. Hubert speaks for the audience, a bit like Horatio might be expected to speak on behalf of Hamlet. When the bastard drew his first picture of war as predator, and Shakespeare writing about war is extraordinary because he talks about the things other people don't want to talk about. The horses dying on the battlefield, the smell of death, the predatory birds feasting on the entrails of men who aren't even dead yet. And the bastard gives this picture. Oh, now doth death line his dead chaps with steel. The swords of soldiers are his teeth, his fangs, and now he feasts, mousing the flesh of men in undetermined differences of kings. Now, in the way that's written, and in the bastard semantics, the word men weighs heavier than the word kings. Mousing the flesh of men in undetermined differences of kings. From whom has borrowed majesty been borrowed? What lies behind the royal fronts and Constance's counterfeit resembling majesty? The kings are masked, but the unseen dead on the fields of France are men. Again and again, the audience of King John is threatened as it stands in for the civilian citizens of Angers, but they can't intervene. The most extraordinary moment comes with the death of little Prince Arthur. Prince Arthur has been taken by Hubert, who has been ordered by the king in a roundabout way to kill him. And he's been taken to prison, and he pleads with Hubert not to kill him. And the poor audience has to sit there while this child tries to woo Hubert with love and obedience, until eventually the fire that he has lit to heat the irons with which he will blind the child goes out. The breath of heaven hath blown his spirit out. What follows eventually is Shakespeare's most daring coup de théâtre. The audience sits mute as Arthur appears on the castle walls. He speaks. He leaps from the castle walls, which must mean he came out above the tiring house, and jumps down. He speaks again and dies. When the body is discovered, it's immediately assumed that Hubert has thrown him off the battlements, and the poor old audience knows what happened, but can't say. Well, they might have shouted. They might have done what children do in a pantomime, but it doesn't alter what happens on the stage. We have another deposition scene in this play as King John hands his crown to Pandulph. Although we might choose to disbelieve John Northbrook, who wrote a Puritan campaigner against the theatre, who wrote in 1577 that interludes taught people how to disobey and rebel against princes, to ransack and spoil cities and towns, to subject the speech and behaviour of the kings to the judgment of the vulgar, was by no means simply to endorse power and legitimacy. Joseph Hall, himself the author of Virgidemiarum, a famous satire, saw that allowing theatricals to present kingship as a matter of mere bombast and strutting, only to be outfaced by the clown and the appreciation of the crowd for the clown, was a way of undermining duly instituted authority. The very fact itself was subversive. A goodly hodgepodge, he called it, Joseph Hall, when vile russetings are matched with monarchs and with mighty kings. Now think of what we would all be like if instead of Shakespeare we had had Racine, where we would have been introduced into a highly formal, courtly notion of the proper concerns of the drama. Instead, we do have Shakespeare, who has mixes them all up together. Wittgenstein was very puzzled by the whole thing. Henry Cross expressed the same argument in Virtue's Commonwealth in 1603. Is it fit that infirmities of holy men should be acted on the stage? There is no passion wherewith the king, the sovereign majesty of the realm, was possessed, but is amplified and openly sported with and made a May game to all beholders. Shakespeare allowed commoners, both on the stage and off, to rub shoulders with his kings. Recent investigations of the composition of the Shakespearean audience have tended to disprove the older idea of the Shakespearean moment when the labourer, the merchant, the justice and the lord were all entertained by the same fare at the same time in the same place. Nowadays, we tend to the view that after about 1594, the Shakespearean theatre audience, especially in the private theatres, was as middle class and well-heeled as it is today, and that the fare offered represented their preferences because they paid much the larger part of the box office receipts. However, it's important to realise that in Elizabethan England, the wealthy could not separate from the poor. The London bourgeois of 1600 lived amid shoals of menials and dependents, most of them as ragged and as battered as the average household servant is today in, say, Bombay. The poorer the household, the scruffier the servants. All kinds of individuals were employed by the playhouse. As a place of promiscuous resort, the playhouse attracted, besides beggars and small boys, prostitutes, pickpockets, and army officers in search of recruits. The soldiers, the conscripts, were being drilled in the river meadows, which the audience would pass on their way to the theatre. So the presence of war and the presence of being pressed for war was something that was in the front of their consciousness. There's no need to posit for the end of the 16th century a theatre-going proletariat that knew what it wanted and how to get it, any more than there would be for today. We may agree that neither in the amphitheatre nor the halls were the riffraff the arbiters of taste, but there is an extraordinary little story told about a justice who was having a play presented before him in his township by Tarleton, who was at one time Shakespeare's colleague, and the rest of his fellows, Her Majesty's servants. The people began exceedingly to laugh when Tarleton first peeped out his head. Tarleton was a comic performer. Whereat the justice, not a little moved, and seeing with his becks and nods he could not make them cease, he went with his staff and beat them round unmercifully on their bare pates, in that they, being but farmers and poor country hinds, would presume to laugh at the Queen's men and make no more account of her cloth in his presence. So it's quite clear who misunderstood how the theatre worked. Shakespeare, if not Hamlet, appears to have been ready to accept the spontaneous reaction of barren spectators. In fact, when he shows you audiences behaving badly, they're usually patricians, as they are, for example, in Love's Labour's Lost, who destroy the play on the stage so that the whole play, including the one with them in it, has to be abandoned. If the poor were nowhere else in the theatre, they were on stage. The on-stage kings are as often rogues and mountebanks who are glad to play 3 hours for 2 pence, as Dekker says in the Raven's Almanac in 1609. The thought gives added plangency to the words of the King of France, "At the end of all's well that ends well." You know, they do say that Shakespeare used to play the king, which may or may not be true. The king's a beggar, now the play is done, and all is well ended if this suit be won, that you express content, which we will pay, with strife to please you, day exceeding day. Ours be your patience then, and yours our parts. Your gentle hands lend us, and take our hearts. the threadbare individuals who, for love of the public, dare to assume the regalia of kingship are the cut-pursers of the empire, who from a shelf a precious diadem steal and put it in the form of receipts for ticket sales in their pockets. Yet such fake monarchs can be more regal than the real. They can, if the playwright wills, construct an icon of royalty that would shame the actual incumbent. And then, if the playwright wills, they can betray it and bewray it. He who plays the king can lay the crown aside and prove more kingly without it. And many an apple wife in the pit could imagine that, like Hamlet, she could have proved right royally had she been put on. Right, thank you.